The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the small town in hues of orange and purple. Margaret, a frail woman in her late 50s, trudged along the cracked pavement. Her once proud stride had been reduced to a shuffle, the weight of life pressing heavily on her. The years had not been kind. Her hands bore the scars of endless toil, and her face was lined with worries of how to make ends meet. Her old coat, patched in several places, barely shielded her from the evening chill. Margaret lived alone in a tiny, dilapidated house at the edge of town. Her husband had passed away years ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and a few fading photographs. Each day was a struggle, filled with odd jobs and meager meals. Yet, despite her hardships, she held onto her integrity like a priceless treasure. As she walked home that evening, her path led her past the town's park. The grass was littered with fallen leaves, and the air carried the faint sound of children's laughter. Her eyes caught something unusual lying by the park bench, a wallet, its leather slightly worn, but still elegant. She hesitated for a moment, looking around to see if someone might claim it. The park was empty except for a dog chasing its tail near a tree. Margaret knelt and picked up the wallet. It felt heavy in her hands. Her heart raced as she unzipped it, revealing a shocking sight: bundles of crisp $100 bills. Her fingers trembled as she counted. There must have been thousands of dollars, far more than she had ever seen in her life. A small voice in her head whispered, "This money could change everything. You could finally pay off the bills, fix the leaky roof, and buy proper food." But another voice, stronger and firmer, reminded her of who she was. "This money isn't yours, Margaret. Someone must be missing it dearly." Her conscience prevailed. Resolute, Margaret checked the wallet for identification. There, tucked behind the cash, was a sleek business card. The name Edward Blake was embossed in gold letters, accompanied by a phone number and address. Margaret's stomach churned. Edward Blake was a name she recognized. He was one of the wealthiest men in town, known for his towering mansion and luxury cars. Margaret's mind was a whirlpool of thoughts. What would a man like Edward Blake even notice about losing this money? Would he reward her? Or would he think she took some of it for herself? The questions lingered, but her moral compass was unwavering. She decided to return the wallet. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by the dim glow of her single bulb, staring at the wallet on the table. Doubts crept in, but she brushed them away. At dawn, she put on her best clothes, a threadbare dress she had patched countless times, and began the long walk to Edward Blake's estate. The journey felt endless, her worn-out shoes barely holding together as she trudged through the town's bustling streets. With every step, her nerves tightened. Finally, Margaret arrived at the imposing gates of Edward's mansion. The estate was a stark contrast to her own life. Pristine lawns, a shimmering fountain, and security cameras at every corner. Her heart pounded as she approached the intercom. Pressing the button, she cleared her throat. I found a wallet. It belongs to Mr. Blake," she said, her voice quivering. Moments later, the gates opened and a butler appeared, his expression unreadable. "Please come in," he said, motioning her forward. As Margaret stepped inside, she felt the enormity of her decision. The air seemed heavier, the walls of the mansion towering over her. She clutched the wallet tightly, unaware that her simple act of honesty was about to set into motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. Margaret followed the butler through the grand entrance, her eyes wide with awe. The interior of Edward Blake's mansion was nothing short of breathtaking. Gleaming marble floors, chandeliers that sparkled like 1,000 stars, and walls adorned with paintings that must have cost more than she could earn in a lifetime. Every step she took felt like an intrusion into a world she didn't belong to. The butler led her to a sitting room where a roaring fireplace bathed the space in a warm, golden glow. "Please wait here," he said, disappearing through a side door. Margaret sat on the edge of a plush sofa, clutching the wallet as if it were her lifeline. Minutes felt like hours, and just as Margaret's anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, the door opened. Edward Blake entered the room, his presence commanding and intimidating. He was a tall man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His sharp features softened slightly when his eyes landed on the wallet in Margaret's hands. "You found my wallet?" Edward asked, his tone even but guarded. "Yes, sir," Margaret replied, standing up abruptly and holding it out to him. "I found it in the park yesterday evening. I wanted to return it as soon as possible." Edward took the wallet, opening it to inspect the contents. His eyes scanned the cash, the cards, and finally rested on Margaret. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was suffocating. "Do you know how much money is in here?" Edward asked, his voice firm but not accusatory. Margaret's throat tightened. "I didn't count it, sir," she lied, not wanting to appear presumptuous. "There's over $10,000, he said, his tone measured. "You could have kept it. Most people would have." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I couldn't, sir. It's not mine. I've always believed that what isn't earned honestly doesn't bring happiness." Edward studied her, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" "Margaret. Margaret Taylor," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what do you do, Margaret Taylor?" "I clean houses, sir. Whatever work I can find," she admitted, feeling a pang of shame as she said it. Edward nodded slowly, his gaze piercing yet contemplative. "You're an honest woman, Margaret. That's rare these days." He turned away, walking toward the fireplace. Margaret's hands fidgeted as she stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. "I should go now," she said softly, feeling out of place in the lavish room. But before she could leave, Edward turned back to her, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. "Wait. Why don't you sit down for a moment?" Margaret hesitated but obeyed, perching on the edge of the sofa. Edward sat across from her, folding his hands in his lap. "You see, Margaret, people like me, we live in a bubble. It's easy to forget the value of honesty, the struggles others endure. You've reminded me of something important." Margaret didn't know how to respond. Her heart raced as she wondered where this conversation was headed. Edward leaned back, his expression softening. "Tell me, Margaret, what's the hardest thing about your life right now?" The question caught her off guard. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "It's everything, sir," she admitted. "Every day feels like a fight. Paying bills, putting food on the table, keeping a roof over my head. But I manage. I always manage." Edward's face hardened, not with anger, but with an emotion Margaret couldn't identify. He sat in silence for a moment before standing up. "Stay here," he said, disappearing through another door. Margaret sat frozen, unsure of what to think. Her mind raced with questions. Was he angry with her? Was he going to accuse her of something? Or was he planning to reward her honesty? Minutes later, Edward returned, holding an envelope. He handed it to her without a word. Margaret hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling. Inside was a check for $10,000. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, I can't accept this," she stammered, trying to hand it back. "You can and you will," Edward said firmly. "Consider it a thank you for reminding me that there's still good in the world. Use it to ease your struggles." Margaret's tears finally spilled over. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice breaking. Edward smiled faintly. "You already did." As Margaret left the mansion that evening, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. But little did she know, this encounter was just the beginning of something far greater. The next morning, Margaret woke up in her tiny, cold home. The events of the previous day felt like a dream, but the check in her trembling hands was very real. $10,000, a fortune beyond anything she had ever imagined. She stared at it, wondering how to make the best use of it. She didn't want to squander the gift or let it change her values. The first thing she did was pay off the debts that had been choking her for years. With what remained, she fixed the leaky roof that had kept her awake during countless storms and bought groceries that filled her kitchen with smells she hadn't enjoyed in years. Still, Margaret didn't splurge on luxuries. She saved every penny she could, determined to use this blessing wisely. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret's life slowly began to stabilize. The stress lines on her face softened, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. Her neighbors noticed the change, asking her how she'd managed to turn her luck around. Margaret shared her story, not to brag, but to inspire. Word of her honesty began to spread throughout the town. People admired her for returning the wallet, but what truly touched them was the humility with which she handled Edward Blake's generosity. Meanwhile, Edward Blake couldn't get Margaret out of his mind. Her act of integrity had awakened something in him. As a man who had built his empire with sharp business acumen, Edward had grown jaded, trusting only contracts and bottom lines. Margaret's simple yet profound gesture reminded him of the values he had long forgotten. One afternoon, Edward paid an unexpected visit to Margaret's modest home. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, she froze. "Mr. Blake, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see how you were doing," Edward said with a genuine smile, "and to ask for your help with something." "My help?" Margaret asked, bewildered. Edward stepped inside, his eyes scanning the humble but now tidy home. "Yes, your help. I've been thinking about people like you, those who work tirelessly but are often overlooked by society. I want to start a foundation to assist people like you, and I can't think of anyone better to guide me than you." Margaret was speechless. "Mr. Blake, I'm just a simple woman. I wouldn't know where to start." "That's exactly why I need you," Edward said earnestly. "You understand what it means to struggle. You have the compassion and wisdom I lack. Together, we can make a real difference." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes again. "I don't know what to say. I've never dreamed of something like this." "Say yes," Edward said with a grin. Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. From that day forward, her life took on a purpose she had never known. She worked with Edward to establish the Margaret Taylor Foundation, aimed at helping struggling families, single parents, and the elderly. The foundation became a beacon of hope in the community. Edward provided the funding, but it was Margaret's empathy and personal touch that made it successful. People from all walks of life found solace and support, and Margaret became a beloved figure in the town. One day, as she stood on the stage at the grand opening of a new community centre funded by the foundation, Margaret addressed the crowd. "I never imagined that returning a wallet could lead to this. But I've learned that even the smallest acts of honesty and kindness can ripple out in ways we can't predict. This isn't just my story, it's our story. Together, we've proven that compassion and integrity can change lives." The crowd erupted in applause. Among them stood Edward, clapping with pride and admiration. As Margaret walked off the stage, she smiled at the thought of how far she had come, from a struggling widow to a symbol of hope for an entire community. This is not just Margaret's story, It's a story of hope, honesty, and the power of doing what's right, no matter how difficult it may seem. If her story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Stories of Hope for more uplifting tales of everyday heroes and life-changing moments. Let's spread hope together.